Welcome, friends, to Beyond the Crucible, the podcast that dares to talk about setback and failure, but not so we can commiserate. It's so we can elevate. I'm Gary Schneeberger, the co-host of the show, and our mission today is to offer you the hope that your crucible experiences, those tragedies and challenges you faced or are facing right now, don't define you. They refine you. They didn't happen to you. They happened for you. And I don't know many people. I don't know any people. And I've surveyed most of the people I know. I don't know many people who know this better than the founder of Beyond the Crucible, the host of this program, and my friend Warwick Fairfax. Warwick, we are back together having what we call on the inside a dialogue episode, but we're going to be talking about some issues, some subjects that's kind of circling around the orbit of Beyond the Crucible.
Absolutely. Very much looking forward to it.
The thing that we're going to talk about, folks, is the latest blog at beyondthecrucible.com. And speaking of crucibles, let me just say this. I have a cold. So if my voice goes in and out, that's me going through a crucible right now. So you're seeing it live or you're hearing it live anyway. But the blog in question that's on at beyondthecrucible.com right now is entitled, Not Sure You've Had a Crucible? 3 Ways to Find Out. And that's what Warwick and I are going to talk about here today. I wrote this blog, Warwick, and it came to me, and I'm interested to see if you've had an experience like this. It came to me, I was thinking of sort of the traditional things that we go through, and I'm like, wait a minute. It occurred to me that there are some people that may listen to the show because they like to hear the kind of triumph stories that we talk about here, who may not identify with having a crucible themselves. And that was intriguing to me. Does that ever cross your mind that not everybody we're speaking to perhaps feels the same way we do about having been through or can identify it, I guess, as easily as you and I can?
Yeah, absolutely, Gary. I think for a number of people, they might think, well, life hasn't been perfect, but I haven't had this massive illness, physical tragedy. I have an okay job and, life is fine. Could it be better? I don't know. Who knows? Maybe, but, life's not perfect. And, but gee, as for tragedy that, something cataclysmic, I haven't had it, fortunately, but yeah, I love hearing the comeback stories of others. So I think there could be a number of listeners that think life's okay, but tragic disaster,
right?
Not really. Yeah, there could be a number of folks in that category.
And one of the things that I think we're going to get to, I know we're going to get to as we go through this episode, because the blog touches on it, is that sometimes crucibles can live in fine. Right. Sometimes mm-hmm. when everything's fine, there can be a crucible in there if you really kind of do what you call all the time soul work of going through, just what direction is your life heading? How's that going? So the whole purpose behind why we did the blog and why we're doing this episode is to serve you listeners. And if you fall into that category where you think, I don't know that I've had a crucible, like Warwick just said, these are some ways that you can maybe suss that out as you're going through your life. And it's funny, I always assume, I'll speak for myself, I won't speak for you, Warwick. I always assume when we do the show that we're talking to people who 100% have had crucibles, but that's just that the research that we've done that found that 72% of people have had I'm going to read the exact words here, have experienced an event so traumatic or painful that it fundamentally altered the course of their lives. I tend to sit down when we do this show and think, every person who's listening has been through that. But that's just not the case, because the research tells us it's 72%, which means what? There's 28% on the other side who don't believe that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So it says that at least on its face, which we'll explore in a moment, that right. 28% have not had a painful experience so painful it fundamentally altered the course of their lives. And 72% is a big number, but 28% is not nothing.
Right. I mean, in baseball, if you're batting 280, you may make the All-Star team, right? I mean, that's a pretty good average in
Yeah.
Major League Baseball. So, and as I sat down to write the blog, I thought of someone who has been on our team, was on our team in the beginning. I joined a little bit after this person, and her team was on the team, but as you were kind of unpacking, I wasn't there for it, but I've heard the stories,
Mhm.
and it always intrigued me as you were talking about the concept of, at the time, Crucible leadership, what Crucibles were, how they felt, how you learned from them, how you moved beyond them. This individual on the team was like, "Oh, I haven't had one of those," and then, I mean, I'll set it up, and because you were there.
Mhm.
As I understand it, the more she sort of thought about it, the more she heard about it, the more she worked on the brand for then Crucible leadership, now Beyond the Crucible. She realized, oops, I think I may be one of those people after all. That's not an uncommon reaction, I don't think, right? I mean, people, if you really, the more you reflect, I think the more you can, it's like hunting for truffles, right? The more you reflect, the more you dig, the more you can find a crucible if it's not right there in front of your face.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it depends what we define as crucible. If it's like, have I fallen off the 200-foot cliff in which, I should have died, but somehow I lived, but, I've spent months in traction and, I've become a paraplegic. And no, I mean, a lot of people would say, well, that's not my story. But have I suffered a significant setback, significant downturn in my life that changed the trajectory at least somewhat? Well, yeah. So part of it is, what do you mean? The crucible sounds like a big thing. So as you talk more about it, I think a lot of folks, maybe some of that 28% would say, well, I've had some painful experiences that have affected my life, and my life was really somewhat different after that.
Right.
Now, it's not as bad as my friend or people I know or people I read about or see on TV, but, so therefore I'm almost embarrassed to say it was a crucible because it was a setback. And yeah, it affected my life, but gosh, I've had it pretty good. And it wasn't like falling off a 200-foot cliff. So they feel embarrassed, but yeah, it actually may be not as big a crucible in one sense from their perspective, but in reality, I remember what one of our first guests, David Charbonnet, said. And
right.
He
I was going to ask you about that. I'm so glad you went there. I was going to ask you about that.
Exactly right. So he was a Navy SEAL like his dad, and he was injured in a training accident, a parachuting accident in Southern California. His parachute didn't open properly, and he became a paraplegic. And I said, gosh, what I went through losing $2.25 billion in my 150-year-old family media company in Australia, yeah, it's a lot of money, but to me, it was nothing compared to what he went through, that physical tragedy. It doesn't even come close.
Right.
And he very graciously said, you know what, Warwick? Your worst day is your worst day.
Right.
It was one of the most profound lessons I've had from my guests, which we have lots of lessons from our guests on this podcast. And so that means your worst day is your worst day. It's not a competition. You might feel like your buddy or friend or family member has gone through a worse crucible than you have, but that's not relevant. The fact is, was it painful to you? That it changed the course of your life at least somewhat? So the bottom line is, I think there are some people that may have been through crucibles without realizing it. They're just too embarrassed to say it's a crucible because it's not as bad as their friends or their family members' crucible.
Right. To use for any people out there who have ever seen the movie Spinal Tap, right? It doesn't have to be turned up to 11, right? It doesn't have to be that high. Your worst day is your worst day. And what I love about that story, every time you tell it, is that was the first live learning that happened to us hosting this show, where we were talking to someone and they've just kept coming and they've kept coming and they've kept coming. And we have a whole bag full of things now that we both have learned from the guests. But that was the first one, that it doesn't have to be, there's no, you have to get to this level of pain in this kind of way for it to be a crucible. Otherwise, it doesn't qualify. Your crucible is whatever it is that causes you pain.
So, Gary, You're speaking about crucibles we might always be embarrassed to talk about. I remember there was somebody that you knew, Bob Krantz, and he mentioned, and he's a Hollywood film producer and has done very well and has had some significant crucibles. But early on, he mentioned that when he was in high school, he wanted to play
Right.
basketball, and he got cut from the team. And it was absolutely devastating to him, and eventually became like the, I don't know, manager or something. And since he had the clipboard and he had to take care
Right.
of the equipment, and
Mm-hmm.
I think he might have even found a way back on the team. But I remember him saying, and you might remember it better than I did, but I remember him saying that felt like a crucible to him. In high school, you don't make the team, and that's, one of the key things you wanted to do in life. That's a crucible. It may not
Absolutely.
seem like it 30 years later, but at the time it was pretty devastating, right?
Absolutely. And back to the definition that's in our survey. Experienced an event so traumatic or painful that it fundamentally altered the course of their lives. At that time in his life, Bob Krantz thought, maybe I'll be a basketball player. Maybe athletics is in my future. And he did not make the team, and that changed everything for him. Now, it turned out, again, through all the guests that we've had on the show, there are crucibles, right? They can, after the bounce back comes the life of significance that can be, this is another thing that we learned going along the way. Blessings come out of crucibles, right? And that's Bob Krantz's blessing. He got into acting and directing and filmmaking, and he's got all that going on. But still, it had to be 35, 40, 50 years later when he was talking to us, he was saying that was painful. That was the one thing he remembered, was not making the 8th grade basketball team. That is, that's pain with a contrail. That will stick with you for a while. So let's talk about the first point in this blog, which is what we've been talking about. Focus on the pain. If you're not sure what you've been through, anything you've experienced in your life is a crucible. Our first tip is this: focus on the pain. One thing all crucibles have in common, no matter how different their circumstances may be, is that they hurt. Searingly so in many cases, but not always. That's important. That's what we've been talking about. It can be really devastating, or it can just be, what feels like a blip, or it's painful to you and everybody else doesn't see it that way, but it is painful. That's what they have in common. So how do you know the difference between, is it just a bad day or is it a crucible? Focus on those words from the survey. Changed the trajectory of your life. Warwick, I love how you say it. You say, who you were before your crucible is not who you are after. Why is that such an apt description? And how can going through that exercise, if someone says, who am I today versus who I was before this thing happened, how can that measurement help them understand maybe you have been through a crucible if you're not sure?
Yeah. I mean, it's when you feel like that there's pain that lingers and it causes you to have a somewhat significant change in your life, that's a clue that at least to some degree, on the spectrum of crucible that it's on there. Is it an 11? Is it an 8? It's not even maybe a relevant question. Is if it feels painful to you, then it's a crucible and it causes some change in your life.
And if it keeps rearing its head, I just heard you say on the last episode that we recorded, you talked about how still to this day, some of the self-doubt, some of the self-recrimination that came up in the aftermath of the takeover of your family media company failing will still kind of bubble to the surface. It's not that you haven't dealt with it, you've dealt with it, but it in many ways it doesn't go away, right? That's one of the things I think can help us understand. Focus on the pain. Is it still there? Is it still bubbling up? Do you still have memories of it? Does it still get you down, or does it still, make you catch your breath? Looking for those things. But that's a great sign, and I see it in your story and in my own story. I've been on the show as a guest, and I've talked about my struggle with alcoholism, and I will say there are days. They don't happen that often anymore, but there are days that I have said since becoming sober 26 years ago that I've said, man, Today's a day I remember why I used to drink. I don't want to drink, but I remember why I used to. And that's me getting close to as close as I'm comfortable and as wise for me to get to the edge of that, going, whatever that thing is inside me that wants to go there, it hasn't been, taken out by a superhero and thrown away. It's still in there somewhere. And that is a great sign. And by great, I don't mean happy. I mean, that is a good sign. That is a solid sign that you've been through a crucible. If you're still like Bob Krantz, you're still, you get on a show to talk about your crucibles, and he's got a crucible where he almost lost his wife and his sons in birth, and he brings up 8th grade basketball not making the team. That is pain that lingers, and that's one of the surest signs, right? One of the surest signs that there's been a crucible in your past.
Absolutely. I think Bob was wife was about to have twins, so
right.
He's about to potentially lose his 2 kids. So yeah, I mean, I think in my own case, and I think I probably mentioned this, Australia is a wonderful place, but when I go back to the part of Sydney I grew up and see family, and I think I'd say we all get on well together. I don't get back there as often as I'd like, certainly post-COVID, but I kind of walk around my old neighborhood, which is a very nice part of Sydney, and it can bring back memories. It can bring back, gosh, how could I have been so stupid? Right. Why did that take over? And what was I thinking? Or just in any large family media business, even a small one, sometimes there's, levels of pain and infighting with the family and just remembering different things that happened, irrespective of who's right and wrong. Yes, it can be, to use a word that's pretty common these days, and a very true word, it can be triggering. Have I dealt with all that? Sure. But was it a crucible? Well, yes. I mean, if you kind of scratch the scab, scratch the itch, it can be painful. I mean, to a degree, when you're being through a crucible, I don't know that it ever fully heals in the sense that there's no scab. Right. You learn to deal with it. Are there consequences? If you get a broken leg or if you get a wound, I mean, there's often a scar. And, you learn to deal with it. There are lessons, even blessings sometimes. But, yeah, I mean, it's, that kind of, the crucibles tend not to ever fully go away. Even Bob Krantz's, he's doing very well in life, but he remembers the pain of being cut from that basketball team. That kind, you remember the pain. That's one way. It's like, I think something happened, but I can't remember it all. And it's like, well, I don't know. Is that a crucible if you can't even remember what happened and that it was painful? Right. As you said, maybe it was a bad day rather than it's not going away, the pain.
And I want to level set again for listeners here to say, we're not trying to push you in a hole. Okay. We're not trying to push you in the pit. We're not talking about these things so that you can, get to use the word that Warwick used, triggered. We're trying to help you understand how to go about thinking about crucibles so that you can heal from them. And the first step to healing is acknowledging that they're there. And that's what we've certainly heard from guests. That's what Warwick's story is. That's what my story is. I mean, Warwick would say 100% he's healed from his crucible, but he just got done talking about how it's not never present. You can be healed and still have, pangs of trouble with it. So that's what we're trying to do here, folks. We're not trying to, convince you against your will that you've had a crucible. We're trying to help you find those places in your life where a crucible might have occurred to help you then move beyond it, because that's what we're all about here at Beyond the Crucible. The second point in this blog, which is at beyondthecrucible.com, the blog is called Not Sure You've Had a Crucible? 3 Ways to Find Out. The second point of 3 is this: are you feeling motivated to live a life with a different focus? Living a life of significance is the North Star of the counsel and stories we share here on this show and through the brand Beyond the Crucible. Crucibles have a way of not just causing us pain, but giving us a fresh perspective. Most of our podcast guests have discovered as they move beyond their crucible that they felt the tug to live life more intentionally, focused on something that they are, what Warwick says, off the charts passionate about. And which in real ways involves serving and inspiring others. Here's the test. If you're experiencing a nagging sense of malaise about the direction your life is headed, in some cases has been headed for decades, it's a good bet those emotions can be traced to a crucible. In fact, it could be what we call here a quiet crucible. One that's not rooted in searing pain, but a feeling of there's got to be more to my life. If you find yourself wondering, is this all there is? We had an entire podcast series on that. Is this all there is? If you find yourself wondering, is this all there is? The root of that question could very likely be a crucible, can it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the quiet crucible is an interesting one. This podcast series, Second Act Significance, we had a number of guests that there was a classic case. It wasn't like an overt tragedy that many of them went through. It just felt like, as you say, is this all there is? So one of the guests we had was Robert Miller, who was a very successful corporate bankruptcy attorney in New York City. As he would say, the challenge he had is he was so successful that he was hard to get out. He was providing a great living for his family.
Right.
But he'd always wanted to be a musician, a rock star. So come about late 50s in his life, he said, you know what, I'm going to do it. And he set up a band to do jazz, kind of rock fusion with a Latin flavor. And he's done very well. But the quiet crucible over the decades was, I'm doing well and it's providing a good living, but I feel like there's something I'm missing in life. Is this all there is? There's something I'm passionate about and I'm not doing. We had another guest, Nancy Volpe Berenger. She was successful for a local chapter of a teachers union in New Jersey, I think it was, and she was doing very well as an executive in that and getting paid pretty decent salary for what she was doing, advocating for teachers. But she got to a point where she was also later in life, 50s or some, where thereabouts, and she had a passion for fashion. And she went back to school with a bunch of other, probably 20-somethings, decades younger than she was,
right?
Which is a little intimidating to be, this older person. And then she got into fashion and passionate about doing fashion for people who, are different and have sort of different needs, and like those with some physical challenges, for instance. So in both those cases, it wasn't like life was over. It wasn't like they were clinically depressed. They just felt like there was something more. They weren't using all of who they were for something that they felt passionate about. Right. In their own ways, living what we call a life of significance, a life on purpose dedicated to serving others. In my case, I've talked about this a little bit. I had my own, if you will, quiet crucible. Yes, our listeners have heard about the $2.25 billion failure of the 150-year-old family media business. And yes, that was a major crucible, a mega crucible.
Big headlines on that one.
Yeah, and 11 out of 10, at least in terms of my own emotional pain. And spiritual pain, for that matter. I was working for an aviation services company in Maryland where we live, and I'd been working there for a number of years, doing financial, business, and then sort of marketing, strategic analysis. I was getting great performance reviews. It was local. So life wasn't bad. I had a young family at the time, young kids. So life was pretty good. But I've had this gnawing sense of, is this all there is?
Right.
And being a person of faith, in my paradigm, I felt like God has given me certain gifts and I'm playing small. And that gnawed away at me because I feel like from my paradigm, if God gives you gifts, he wants you to use it for some purpose that you think that you're passionate about and, you think that, lines up with your values. So I ended up, quitting. I'd gone to a mid-career coach who said I had a good profile as an executive coach. I went to my first International Coach Federation conference in Denver, and I began to explore being a certified executive coach. Eventually, from being a coach, as listeners know, I gave a talk in my church about my story that led to me writing the book Crucible Leadership, Embrace Your Trials to Your Life Significance. That ended up turning into a podcast, Beyond the Crucible, and all that we do here. But that quiet crucible, in a sense that started it all, was, is this all there is? I'm doing well at this aviation services firm, but I feel like I'm not using all that I am, all the skills and abilities and passions that God had given me. So that was definitely a quiet crucible. I wasn't clinically depressed. I wasn't sobbing. It was like, life is not bad, actually. Life is reasonably good, but there could be more. And that was, there could be more, that led me to make a significant shift in my life.
It's interesting, the really major ones, the first group that we talked about, right? Focus on your pain. Those are things like my alcoholism, you're losing the company. Those are big ones. And everybody sort of knows they're a crucible. These that we're talking about now, this is the second time I'll say this, and because it keeps coming up, you find them in the fine, right? Everything's fine. Everything's fine. Right. And it's not, there's something gnawing in there. I think, the goal here would be, and that's what you did, what you just described. You found the refine in the fine, right? You were refined by the fine. There was something there that was missing, and it gnawed at you, and it didn't knock you knock you over on the ground. You probably could have played out the string in what you were doing, but you wanted more than that. That's that kind of quiet crucible. So they do come, unfortunately, folks, they come in all shapes and sizes, right? They can come in the big deluxe model, like Warwick experienced in Australia, and they can come in that quiet model that he experienced in that cubicle. And to go back to the Charbonnets that you mentioned earlier, you can't compare those and say one's worse than the other, right? That both of them have very real repercussions and very real things that we have to learn from. So let's go on to the third point, because it kind of connects the first two, right? The third point in this blog, not sure you've had a crucible, 3 ways to find out at beyondthecrucible.com, is point 3 is keep your radar up. And by that we mean, and this is true, one of the indisputable things about crucibles is that they can come at any time, and they can come again. They are not, as we say here about other things, a one and done thing. They can come again. Just because you've had a crucible, it's not like, okay, I'm done for the rest of my life. No, they can come back. They can be triggered by any tragedy or trauma as well. And we think of many of the stories and insights from them that we share here as inoculations that can help you, the listener, weather the next crucible you encounter, helping your bounce back with more focus and fortitude, even if you have a hard time identifying the last one you encountered. So you've got, in the first one, the painful crucible. Point 2 is more the quiet crucible found in the fine. This is just as you're moving through life, keep your radar up and be aware of circumstances that can come up and change the trajectory of your life by changing some ticks in your heart, changing some things in your mind, changing some circumstances in your life. Beware of those things. Keep your radar up. That will help inoculate you against really falling into the pit, as Warwick says.
Absolutely. And it's a great point, Gary. Just because you've had a crucible, or if you've not had one, life tends to be challenging. I think of a former prime minister of ours in Australia back in the 70s, Malcolm Fraser, a Conservative member of Parliament. His election campaign was, amongst other things, saying, life wasn't meant to be easy. Now, from a public relations standpoint, you would
Yeah.
never, ever use that as a slogan, because it's like, that may be true, but it's not a vote winner. You know, the
No.
vote winner is, I've got a plan and your life will get a lot better.
Right.
That sells. But he was in a moment of madness. Maybe he was pretty honest. Well, life wasn't meant to be easy. Life is difficult. And so things will happen. So the question is, when you get hit or triggered by that tragedy or trauma, be it big or small or quiet crucible, you very often can't avoid getting hit or triggered, and there will be pain. I don't know there's any solution to say, we can guarantee you when the next crucible comes, there'll be zero pain, zero impact, zero scars. You'll sail right through it smiling and merrily skipping down the road. And no, I mean, we're not going to promise that. Is it possible? I've not seen it myself, but
No,
who knows? But what we can do is try to help the depth of that pit be, not as deep, and getting through that. And getting through that pit, if you will, have it be a quicker process. So, some of the things I think of, just there are small things that happen, from day to day. And for me, what I try and focus on is, okay, so what just happened? Why did I suddenly get triggered? Let me understand it. Is there something I have to do differently, think differently, act differently? If it's about some other person, okay, got it. Maybe they did something that I wish they hadn't, but let me forgive them. Forgiveness is a huge thing. I can't think of anybody we've had on the podcast who haven't dealt with the issue of forgiveness. It could be forgiving themselves, like for me, in large part, not exclusively, but in large part for the whole takeover tragedy, if you will. But there are things that you can do to try and bounce back quicker. Is understand what happened, identify. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not. Figure out what happened, learn the lessons from it. It could be, like back to high school, don't hang out with the cool crowd who forces you to be somebody that you're not. Hang out with different people that like you for who you are. So there are actions that you can take, there are lessons. I've mentioned forgiveness, forgiving maybe people or yourself that maybe behaved in ways you feel you shouldn't have, or they shouldn't have. And then maybe looking for blessings. For me, with the whole tragedy, losing the 150-year-old family business, I became more fully who, from my perspective, God designed me to be. I'm a reflective advisor. I'm not some corporate takeover CEO of some $700 million business. That's not me. I don't have any desire to run some massive company and make 100 decisions before breakfast. And that's just not me. And then with the quiet crucible of leaving the aviation services company, that was I using skills at that company, strategic planning, financial analysis skills? I had those skills. But I wasn't using all of the skills I had, and I wasn't necessarily off the charts passionate about my job. It was a job and it was fine, but it really led to me more fully becoming me, leaving that and getting into coaching and then writing a book and now this podcast. So I think we can't guarantee that you'll avoid pits, but we can do is help you understand what happened and get through them quicker, bounce back quicker, and move in a direction that you feel like does give you joy and fulfillment, does give you a life of significance, which is really for true joy and fulfillment. You do, from our perspective, need to live a life of significance, which is other focused and purpose focused. So you can't always avoid crucibles, but I think there are things you can do to inoculate yourself against the worst symptoms of the disease so that you can bounce back quicker.
Right. And again, I'll say it again before we wrap up here, folks. We're talking about this stuff not to push you in the pit. We're not talking about this stuff to waylay you, to convince you bad things happen when bad things didn't happen. We're trying to give you tools to help you recognize what crucibles look like when they show up if you don't have an immediate grasp of Yes, I've had one. Yes, I've had two. Yes, I've had three. But then also, what we do at Beyond the Crucible is give you those tools to help you get through them. Um, uh, Find them, search them at beyondthecrucible.com. Whenever we do a show like this, Warwick, that's based off a blog, we end with this is something that you started when you were the first one to write a blog. And you end with reflection questions, which tells you a little bit about when Warwick says, I'm not a guy that wants to run a $750 million company and make 100 decisions before, but I'm a reflective advisor. Here's your proof. He's the one who created on blogs at Beyond the Crucible, end with reflection questions. So here, based on our discussion, here's some reflection questions that can help you understand what we've been trying to impart in this episode, but also understand what next steps to take. So the first question is this: think of a painful experience from your past. Did it teach you something you're using in your life today? If so, it's likely you've had a crucible experience. Second, do you ever feel like something is missing in your life? That you would love to be living a different story? If so, it's likely you've had a crucible experience. And then the last bit, so the first two bits are about identifying, have you had one? Where was it? What can I learn from it? Here is where the help comes in. What bit of information have you heard from Beyond the Crucible, either the podcast or from the other resources that we have at our website, beyondthecrucible.com? What bit of information have you heard or read that can help you if you encounter a crucible in the future? I'm going to land the plane on this episode, Warwick, by turning that into a bit of a question for you. What are some takeaways that you would give to folks who've heard this about anything that we've talked about? Really difficult crucibles that knock you down, quiet crucibles that maybe keep you feeling fine when you're not really fine, keeping your radar up so you can be aware and get inoculated for when the next. I mean, crucibles tend to come in meteor storms sometimes. How do you knock that away? How do you do that? So what's some advice, some counsel, some wisdom that you want to leave listeners with?
I think the thought that I'm really been thinking about is one of the challenge for those that might be in the 28% that say, gosh, no, I haven't really had a crucible that was so traumatic it fundamentally changed the course of my life. That could be true, but there could be a percentage of those who feel embarrassed, feel guilty, feel like, gosh, I didn't lose $1 billion company, what have you, which I feel like is not as, let me try that again. You might feel, gosh, I didn't suffer a physical tragedy like David Charbonnet becoming a paraplegic after a training accident as a Navy SEAL. You might be embarrassed to talk about your crucible. Like Bob Krantz, maybe there was a time in which he might have been embarrassed to talk about the crucible of being cut from his, school basketball team. But don't be embarrassed. It's not a competition. As David Charbonnet said, your worst day is your worst day. So don't let that stop you from saying, well, gosh, maybe it was somewhat of a crucible, even if a quiet crucible. I need to recognize it, acknowledge the pain, learn the lessons of it, whether were mistakes I made. Are there people I have to forgive? Forgiveness, as we always say, doesn't mean condoning. Is there something I have to deal with amidst the crucible? Learning the lessons of it? Is it pointing me to a new direction in my life where I'm using the pain from the ashes of the crucible, where I'm using the pain from the ashes of the crucible to help others? Maybe I have this vision. Maybe it will lead to a life of significance, a life on purpose dedicated to serving others. So I guess my overall thought is, don't be embarrassed to feel like, gosh, what I've been through is nothing like some of the stories I've heard on this podcast, or nothing like a friend of mine or a family member. And therefore, I'm not even going to call it a crucible. I'm not going to deal with it because, look, life is pretty good. I have a roof over my head. I have a nice family. a decent job. I'm embarrassed to even complain. Why should I complain? I have it pretty good.
Everything's fine. Everything's
exactly.
fine.
But it's not about complaining. It's about acknowledge that there is pain, and maybe you want to make some changes to live life differently, and maybe you will end up helping people that wouldn't have been helped otherwise.
Great place to land the plane. I'm gonna put a little like addendum on this, I think, because we say all the time on this show, you got to do the inner work. And what we're talking about there most of the time is doing the inner work to learn the lessons of your crucible and to move beyond it and bounce back from it. Here we're kind of expanding the definition of or when you do the inner work, and that's doing the inner work to dig around and see, have you been hurt in a way that there's some emotional cartilage that's been torn that maybe you didn't know about. That's what we're trying to do here, is to help you do the inner work to determine if there's more inner work to do about how to bounce back from a crucible. So we hope that this episode has been edifying in that way for you. And until the next time that we are together, we do understand what we've just talked about here, that crucible experiences are painful, they're hard, they can be terribly traumatic, and they can be, everything's fine when it's really not. But there's pain involved, and from that pain, we can feel immobilized sometimes. But here's the good news. When you learn the lessons of your crucible, when you apply those lessons and you move forward in pursuit of the next act that you want to pursue beyond your crucible, it's not the end of your story. It's the start of a new chapter of your story that can be the most rewarding chapter of your story, because the goal that you're aiming for, the destination that you'll reach at the end of the yellow brick road, is a life of significance. If you enjoyed this episode, learned something from it, we invite you to engage more deeply with those of us at Beyond the Crucible. Visit our website, beyondthecrucible.com, to explore a plethora of offerings to help you transform what's been broken into breakthrough. A great place to start? Our free online assessment, which will help you pinpoint where you are on your journey beyond your crucible and to chart a course forward. See you next week.